Okay, everyone, welcome back. So today we are going to be looking at Egyptian culture, and we've already been kind of talking about the dynasties and things along that line. So today we're going to get into kind of more the nitty-gritty stuff and things that really kind of dictated how Egyptians lived. Now, the most important thing to understand here is that the city was the focus of everything, and everybody lived in or near a city. We talked about this already that the cities were important because of the desert. You have to live close to the Nile, so everybody was kind of jammed together. And the cities were the center of everything. And the cities really had three main roles. There was either a trading city, a religious city, like for instance the cities of Karnak or Heliopolis were designed just for religious worship, that people would go there at certain times of the year to pray and to do religious festivals. Or you had centers of administration where the pharaoh's bureaucracy would live. It's where the tax collectors would come from. And so each city had a purpose. But the fact of the matter is everybody was tied to some type of city. And when you look at the map on the right, you can see all those cities. I mean, even more so than the Fertile Crescent. That's how important cities were. And so, again, everything revolved around them. So, really, one of the most urban cultures we've ever had. And as you can see here, some great pictures. We have the city of Karnak, which was the important religious center. And you've got all of these statues on the left. You've got the Sphinx on the right, and all those are smaller sphinxes, not the Sphinx, which we already talked about, but really just these tremendous centers of worship. And here is a picture of what we think Heliopolis looked like. As you can see, you've got incredible paintings on buildings, you've got lots of temples. Of course, unfortunately, some slaves building some things that's a little bit later that we'll get to, but nonetheless, incredible cities and centers of trade. Memphis, on the other hand, is a great example. That was actually one of the first capitals of Egypt, and as you can see here, a walled city, but you don't really see as much in the way of temples and things like that because that wasn't the purpose of the city. This was an administrative center where the law was carried out. Now, when we move on, we have our social structure. Now, social structure is really interesting because of the position of the pharaoh. The pharaoh is very, very unique in world history. Here's a guy who's considered to be a king and a god. Not like kind of a god, that he really was the embodiment of a god. And when he died, he directly ascended into the underworld and became a god. And this is really interesting because you don't really see this anywhere else in history. And what was weird is that because they were a god, they weren't really expected to act like men. They were expected to be like God, and in some cases even the Nile, that they were very cool, they were very calm, that they didn't show emotion, but they had complete and utter control. If the pharaoh decided to do something, it was immediately done. If the pharaoh did something crazy, it really didn't matter what it was. I mean, a pharaoh could say something like today that, we no longer are celebrating Wednesday, then Wednesday is now gone. This guy controlled everything, until really you get to some of our modern leaders with the weapons that they have available to them. No other ruler was as strong as a pharaoh. And you can tell that just due to the fact that simply they built the pyramid. I mean, if you think about that for a second, that the entire universe stopped for 20 years and they built a pyramid. And there were no uprisings. There were no real complaints that the pharaoh needs it, and this is what they do. And so at the top, no one can even touch him. Now, as we go down, and as you can see here, really it's kind of the same type of thing. The only thing that's a little bit different is as pharaohs got more involved in the religious aspect of it and gods, they needed someone to carry out the day-to-day stuff. And that came down to the vizier. And it really does depend on the vizier how powerful they are. That's why I kind of have that there. But the fact of the matter is this was the pharaoh's right-hand man. This guy had tremendous power. And this guy really is who the regular people will interact with. Regular citizens, you don't get to see the pharaohs. Okay, they live and they're off kind of on the side. After the viziers, you have your bureaucrats and your administrators. They're the guys that are carrying out the laws, and most importantly, they collect taxes. Below them are priests. And here, which is very interesting, even though you have a link between religion and the state with the pharaoh, the priests definitely aren't necessarily seen as strong as the bureaucrats, which is something kind of a theme we're going to talk about later. Then you have your craftsmen, then you have your laborers and kind of your farmers, and then, of course, at the bottom, slaves. Now, Egypt wasn't necessarily flush with slaves. Slaves tended to work for the very, very wealthy. As we talked about, slaves did not build the pyramids, slaves did not build the temple, but nonetheless, there were still slaves. What's really unique about this particular culture, though, is its stance on women. And unlike, say, other places that we'll talk about, like Greece and things like that, women in Egypt had tremendous power. As I have there, they are able to have property and they can own it. They are able to get divorced. And not that we're saying divorce is good, but when you have something in the law that states if a woman is abused, if a woman is mistreated, she can get a divorce, that is a huge step in women's right that actually in many countries women wouldn't even be allowed to get a divorce in some cases till the 1900s. So you can see the Egyptians were ahead of the curve. They could participate in business, they could trade. Um, and basically, the theme here, they could actually represent themselves. In other words, they were an entity and they were free. And as you see at the pictures on the right, these are depictions of women in art, and they're depicted here playing music and in fine clothing, and they're not depicted as kind of servile, which we would see in other cultures. Now, on the flip side, they couldn't be artisans, they couldn't be soldiers, and for the most part, if they wanted a job, they were either making clothes or in the field. So it wasn't like they had complete freedom to do whatever they wanted, but when you compare women to anywhere else in the world at the time, the Egyptians were way ahead. So much ahead that they actually had women rulers. Nubia actually would have a lot of queens, and we'll actually talk about them a little bit later. But there were some female pharaohs, and the most notable was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was in the New Kingdom, and she really is one of the first woman to take the title of pharaoh and hold it. She ran the country. There was no doubt she was in charge. Um, I have there, she's one of the most, she's probably the first cataloged woman in history. In other words, she's one of the first women that history books actually talked about her. And that gives you a level because throughout history we don't really have many references to women. Um, she actually depicted herself as a man. As you can see there, that's a bust of her, and they have her having the beard. So she assumed the power. She led military expeditions. She was a builder. She was actually even able to gain land for Egypt to control through negotiation. She didn't even have to fight. And probably the most impressive temple she ever built was the one on the side, the Deir el Bahari temple, which was carved basically into the side of a mountain, and really one of the most incredible and beautiful temples we have. And so again, Egypt, you see here, kind of bucking the trend and doing these things that are so different than everybody else. And undoubtedly, the stuff that we know the most is religion. Religion was incredibly important. Of course, the pharaoh was God, so it has to be important. They were very different, though. Most of their gods are often depicted as not only taking human form, but taking the form of some type of animal. And this again is showing how, humans, we're not like gods. We don't look like them. Um, Now, the most important god, it really did depend on the dynasty. Okay, early on, it was the god Ra, who was the sun god, because even back in the day, we know that without the sun, we don't have crops and we all die. So the sun gods are always super important. Okay, in other cultures, it was Amun, at other times it was Osiris, and then if you look in the middle, at one point you had Ra, who was the pure sun god, Amun, who was kind of a sun god and a god of some other things. So in the New Kingdom, they kind of put it all together, and then they just called him Amun Ra. So you see all of this as really, really crucial. On the far right, you have another god called Thoth, who is the god of scribes, once again, which we talked about this already, telling us how important writing is. Well, the other really interesting thing here, though, is that one of their most popular gods, and a goddess who would actually last the longest, is Isis. Far after the New Kingdom fell, the cult of Isis remained for hundreds of years, even into the time of Cleopatra. And then eventually, what happens is when Egypt becomes Christian in Roman times, This is one of the strongholds of the cult of Mary. And so the believers in Isis just kind of switched from Isis to Mary. So again, seeing the role of women here, that they really have an opportunity. And if you worship a female god, that means you have some type of respect for women, which is nice. In Egypt, we have a very specific afterlife. The main god of the afterlife is Osiris. And if you look in the picture here, Osiris is in green to signify that he was killed. Osiris was one of the main gods, and as the story goes, he was killed by his brother Seth. Or a jackal god, that Seth was jealous that Osiris was the king of the gods and decided to kill him. Unfortunately, Osiris was not that smart because he tricked Osiris into having him test out a sarcophagus. So he laid down in a coffin, which I would avoid doing. Then he proceeded to suffocate him, then cut his body up and spread it all over Egypt. Luckily enough for Osiris, though, and then, I'm sorry, Seth took over. But his wife, Isis, who was pretty awesome, was able to reassemble the body and bring him back to life, although he had to stay in the underworld. Now, with Osiris, Isis had a son, Horus, who you see this guy over here, the falcon god. Horus was then able to overthrow his uncle Seth, and then all of the pharaohs of Egypt are supposed to be descended from Horus. So as you can see, this is very important. It kind of sets up the pharaoh as a god. But what's more important is that Osiris was the lord of the underworld. And the underworld was where all the souls went. And this was very important, that they did believe in something called the Ma'at, or your soul. And when you died, your soul descended into the underworld. And in the underworld, you would meet Horus, the guy in green. Or not Horus, I'm sorry, Osiris, the guy in green. Now, Osiris would then take your heart and he would weigh it on a scale. If your heart was lighter than a sacred feather, you went to heaven, and heaven was wonderful and it was great and everything was really fantastic. Okay, and there you would be reunited with your body. And we talked about this before. That's why the Egyptians mummified their dead, because if you went to heaven, you would be reunited with your body and you would live in paradise. Now, if your heart was heavier than a feather, it meant you weren't a good person, and then you got to meet Amit. Amit is this guy over here on the right, and he is better known as the Devourer of Souls. He's part lion, part hippo, and part crocodile, which of course are the three most dangerous animals for the Egyptians, and he would eat your soul. Not so good. But this is really one of our first cultures where you have an in-depth view of the afterlife. However, the other interesting thing is that it is indeed the Egyptians which were one of also your earliest groups to practice monotheism. There was a pharaoh, this guy on the bottom here, and on the top. His name was Akhenaten, and he came to become obsessed with the god Aten, which was one of the sun gods, not Amun, not Ra, but Aten. Don't have to worry about how he evolved, but nonetheless it was that. So he became so obsessed with Aten that he changed his name from Akhenaten to Akhenaten and declared that there was only one god in Egypt and we're all going to worship Aten. He actually built a new capital called Akhetaten, which was the main capital of his dynasty and where you would go worship the sun. And nonetheless, he really tried to convert everybody to this religion. Unfortunately, most people really didn't like it, and in the end, it failed. But you did have your first stab at it. It was his son, Tutankhamun, or better known as Tutankhaten, that took over when he died, and as a result, he changed everything back to the way that it was. But we can't deny it had that first step. And so when eventually a religion like Christianity gets there, there was some experience in Egypt with a monotheistic religion. Nonetheless, though, it really didn't work. But in the end, they at least had it. So as you can see here with Egyptian culture, it's very interesting. We have these city dwellers who really run their own lives, and there's lots of freedoms for peasants, there's freedoms for women, but religion is really central. But what you can really say about Egypt is that they were a united culture, and we can see these aspects of the culture no matter what the social class, no matter what the social standing, and no matter where they lived in the country. And that is why you can often refer to Egypt as the first ever nation. Okay, so hopefully we got some good questions on this, and I will see you guys tomorrow.